Hey coders, welcome to Coding Sorting with NJ. This particular video that you are currently watching is actually fifth video in the series that we have started, where we are creating an e-commerce website without any frameworks and libraries. We are developing our front end and back end as two separate independent websites that are communicating with each other through fetch APIs. We are also developing this e-commerce website as a REST API based website. Our backend offers its services through REST APIs, which are consumed by our front end. Besides that, we are also implementing this website as a single-page application-based website. Our backend is implemented in PHP and our front end is JavaScript based, and none of the files contains entangled PHP and JavaScript code mixed together, or HTML for that matter. So we have paid special attention to separation of concerns concept as well. So that is the basic overview. Now let's get to the business of our today's tutorial. In today's tutorial, we will be implementing our login and registration system. So let's start our coding sorting by creating a separate file for all the logic related to login and registration purpose. So in our front end, let's create a new file. Let's give it name login.js. Now let's go to index.html and link that file with our HTML file. Okay, so we have linked the login.js file with the HTML file, but let's go up, and where we have defined all those icons, the 4 icons that we can see in the browser, let's give all of those titles as well, so that when the cursor hovers over those icons, we could see the tooltip, which will help the user know what is the purpose of that icon. So this icon, when the cursor hovers over it, it will show the login tooltip. And this one, register, logout, let's go and check in the browser if it works. So login, we can see this tooltip, register, logout, and logged user. Now let's go and start working on login.js file. So before we define any login or registration related logic, let's define some helper functions, which will basically help us show or hide all of those 4 icons. Let's start off by defining a helper function. Let's give it a name, show hide icon, and we need to pass it 2 parameters. The first one is going to be the icon that we want to either show or hide, and second one is the flag, which is a boolean value. True means we want to hide the icon, and false means we want to show the icon. So let's use ternary operator and check the value of flag. If it's true, in that case we want to set its display property to none, else set its display property to block. And that's all we needed to define for this helper function. Over here, let's get references to all 4 of the icons. So const login document.query selector login, const register document.query selector register, logout document.query selector logout, const logged user document.query selector log -user. Okay. Now we can pass any of these references to this show hide icon, and if the second value we pass to be true, then that icon will get invisible, and if the second parameter is false, then that icon will be made visible. So let's call it on register, and let's set it to true. So now when we go to the browser, you will notice that we won't be able to see the register icon because we have hidden it by calling this function, passing the register reference to it along with the true flag. So let's test it out in the browser. And as you can see, there is no registration related icon. If we put the false back, it will be made visible again. Now you can see the icon over here. Likewise, if we pass login with the value true, now you can't see the login icon. So this function is going to come handy when we define the logic for all of those 4 icons. Okay, now we can start working on the actual logic. So before we define any further logic over here, let's go and have a peek at the table that is going to be used for logging and registration purposes. So this is our database table that we are using, and this is the table that I have created, user. Let's go and look at its properties first. So it has a column ID, which is primary and not null. Username is not null and it has to be unique. Email also not null and it has to be unique as well. Password is not null. First name and last name can be null. So these are the properties. Now as far the data is concerned, I have already put in lots of users data. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to keep this 1, and for the rest I'm going to delete them. Oh, I think I deleted everything. Let's make it AAA at AAA.com. Password also AAA. First name is AAA and last name is AAA as well. Of course, you can make this table as complex as you like, such as instead of putting password straight away, you can put the hashes over here. But I have chosen to skip that part so that I can focus on the other things that I want to show you guys. Okay, now let's create this row. A user with the name AAA and password AAA as well. Okay, so this is the table. Our username is unique and email is also unique. Now let's go back to our login.js file. So let's start by associating an event listener with the login icon. And the callback function for this event handler is user login. Now let's define this function. Let's pass the event so that we can prevent the default behavior associated with it. Oh, this is actually user, so R was missing. Now let's work on this user login function. Now when we click on this login icon, we want the login form to appear. And the visual appearance that we want to give it is the same one that we gave for when you click on any product. Something like this. So we want an overlay to appear over here, and within that overlay, we should have this model in which instead of displaying these contents, we want to see a form with username and password fields and a button to submit it. So that means we can reutilize the logic that we have defined for this overlay. But the thing is this, the contents of this model are different. So for the product, these are the products that we want to see. For the login functionality, we want to see a form with only 2 fields. And for the registration purpose, we want to see a field with more than 2 fields: username, password, email, first name, and last name. So what we are going to do is that we are going to revisit the logic that we have defined for the overlay and model. And if you remember from the previous video, we actually defined 2 divs, one for this overlay and one for this model. Now what we are going to do is that we are going to add one more div to that logic. So one div is going to contain this overlay, one div is going to contain this empty model, the white background and this area, and the third div is going to contain the actual contents, because contents are the ones that are different for each of the functionalities. So this way we will only be focusing on redefining the contents of that div, and we don't have to work on redefining the overlay as well as this whole model and make it appear and disappear, because this way we can reutilize the logic that we have already defined. So let's go back to that overlay function and make slight tweakings there. I think we have defined the overlay in the global.js file. So let's open it. Yeah, this is remove overlay. And in this function, get product details, which gets executed once we click on any product. So over here we were defining a div with the class name overlay, and we attach an event listener, remove overlay to it. Then we defined a model div with the class name model as well, and then we appended everything, the contents of the contents that we can actually see in that model directly. So what we are going to do is that we are going to create one more div over here. And what name shall we give to it? Let's make it model container document.create element div, model container dot class name. Let's give it the class name model hyphen container. Now if you notice over here, we are appending the model directly to the main element of HTML. Now what we are going to do is that we are going to append the model to the model container. So model container dot append child, let's pass the model to it. And now to the main, instead of appending the model to it, let's pass model container to it. So the model is inside another div which is named model container, and we are attaching the model container to the main element. We don't have to make any further changes to this function. Now let's go to remove overlay function. So over here we were getting references to overlay and model, and then we were checking if they are present, then remove them. Now what we need to do is that change this model to model container. Okay, so if model container is present, then remove it. Now since the model is the child of model container, so if a model container is removed, then so is the model. One more thing I have noticed, we don't need this reference to main over here because it was never used anywhere inside this function, so I have commented it out. Now the only thing left is that we have to go back to our CSS file and make some changes according to the changes that we just made. Now let's look for the model class. Now this model is going to become model hyphen container. However, this display grid and these things, let's remove them and let's define the model and put it over here. So this model container is defining the white model that was appearing, and this model is defining the contents, which in this case are grid. Now what we need to do for the rest of the two functionalities, that is the login and registration, we are going to have these two reutilize for those ones. So this overlay and this model container, we are going to reuse them. However, instead of having the third div as model, we will give it some other class name and we will separately define the CSS style for that. We still need to make some more changes over here, but before we do that, let's go and test it out in the browser that the changes that we have made so far, if they are still working or not. Refresh to be certain. Now click somewhere. So we are able to see the model, overlay and model. Now click. So everything is working. Now let's go back. So what we are going to do is that we are going to cut the div which is creating the overlay, as well as the reference to main and where we are appending the overlay to the main, and then model container, these lines. So copy and comment them out over here. Let's create another function, display overlay. So this will be passed the actual model contents that we want to attach to it. Okay, I have pasted back the lines that I commented out in the get products details. So now let's have a peek at them. So over here we are creating a div with the class name overlay, then attaching an event listener to it. And over here we are attaching to main this overlay, but we don't have a reference to this main over here. So let's, for the time being, comment this line out where we are creating a reference to the main in the get products function and put it in this function over here. Okay, so now we have a reference to main, and then we are passing this overlay as a child to this main. Then we are creating a div with the class name model container. So let's go back over here. We have to remove these two lines as well. Copy, comment this out. Over here, paste them back. So the model that we are now receiving as a parameter, we are appending that as a child to model container, and then we are attaching that model container to the main as well. So the logic which was creating the overlay div as well as the model container div, we have moved it from the product details function to a new function with the name display overlay. And we have also removed the reference to the main element from product details function to the display overlay function as well. Now we need to call this function inside the get products details function. So let's go to the end of the function. This is yellow starting curly bracket, and this one is the ending curly bracket. So let's call this function display overlay, and we are passing this model that we are creating to this function, and hopefully everything should work fine. Let's refresh to be certain. Click, nothing happens. Uncaught reference model is not defined yet. Model is not defined yet. So the thing is this yellow curly bracket is for this get products details function, but we have actually defined the model div inside this inner function, response inventory. So we need to bring that display overlay function call within these pink brackets, because this is where inside this response inventory function we have actually defined the model. So let's go down and cut it and paste it before this pink curly bracket, because that's the ending curly bracket of the inner function where we have defined our model. Okay, let's refresh one more time. Click somewhere and we are able to see the overlay. Good, so everything is working fine. Let's do a little bit of tidying up, which simply means just delete the lines that we moved to another function. Now wherever we need to display that overlay, we simply have to call this display overlay function and pass the only div which are going to be the contents of the model, and for only that we will have to define the styling. The rest is going to be already defined. Okay, so we are done with that part. Now let's go back to our login.js file. Now let's get back to user login function once more, and over here we want to display an overlay, and within that overlay we want to display a login form. So let's create that form first. So let's create a div, and within that div we will create the form, and then we will call the display overlay function and pass that div to that function, and as a result we will be able to see the overlay when we click on the login icon. So let's start with the div. Again, let's give it the name model document.create element div. Let's give it form div because we are going to define different styling for it. Okay. Form div.class name equals form div. Now let's create a h2 element. Document create element h2. h2 the text contents equals login form. Form div dot append child h2. Now let's create a form. Let's give it class name. Login form. Now let's create two input fields, one for username and other for password. So const, let's make it username, document create element input, username dot type equals text, username dot name equals username, username dot placeholder equals username. Let's create one more input field for the password. So const password document dot create element input. Now the type of this input field is going to be password. This way we won't be able to see the actual key that we are typing in. Rather we will be seeing the dots or asterisks in place of those keystrokes. Password dot name equals password. Password dot placeholder equals password as well. Now let's create an input field of type submit. Submit document dot create element submit. Submit dot type equals submit. Submit dot name equals submit as well. Let's make it login. Now attach all of these fields to the form element. So the name that we give to our form is login form. So login form dot append child. The first field is username. Login form dot append child. The second field is password. Login form dot append child. The last field is submit. Now append this login form to the form div. So form div dot append child login form. We have already appended the h2 element to this. Now we have to call display overlay function and pass this form div to it as its argument. Now let's go and test it out in the browser. Okay, where is login icon? Let's go up. So we are calling this function on login. That's why we were not able to see the login icon. Okay, now let's click on the login. And we are able to see this overlay, and within this overlay we have this model, and inside this model we have this h2 element as well as form. So we can't see the submit, but it's there. Now the only thing left is that we have to define the styling for it. But before that we have to check that why aren't we able to see the submit button. Okay, the element is input. Good. So we have already defined some styling for the input element of type submit. So that's why we can see some styling defined for this. Now let's go and define the actual styling for this form. Let's go to the end of the CSS file. Login and registration form styling. So the class name that we gave to farm was login-farm. Let's set display to flex direction column. Copy, paste, and put asterisk because we are going to define some margins and headings for all of these. So let's start with margin. Let's each give margin top. Let's make it 5 pixels. Heading top bottom, let's make it 3 pixels, and left right 3 pixels as well. Let's go back to the login form and let's define some margin all around. So for the top bottom, let's make it 10 pixels. Left and right, let's also make it 10 pixels. That's better. Let's make this one 5 pixels. Okay. Now font size, let's make it large. Okay, that's better. Now you can see this submit button is slightly shorter than those input fields. That's because the submit button is getting the styling that we have defined when we are defining the submit button for this search element. So let's work on that. So within this login form, we are looking for an input field of type submit. Let's give width 100%. Okay, that's better. Now let's put some more space between these input fields. So margin top, let's make it 8 pixels. The reason I'm being frugal with these margin spaces is that once we are defining the registration form, then we will need to put more input fields. So those input fields might overflow. So that's why I'm being frugal at the moment. So when we get to registration, we might encounter that problem and we might have to revisit these values. But for the time being, I am keeping it as such and moving on. Okay, so now what we have to do next is that we have to associate an event listener with this submit button such that when it's clicked, a request should go to our backend along with the values in these input fields. And once the backend receives those values, it will try to look for a user with the provided username and password. If there does exist such user with the matching username and password, then the user will be logged in. Otherwise, the login will fail. So now let's define this event listener. So let's go to login.js, and over here we were defining the submit button input field. So now let's associate an event listener with it. So when it's clicked, user login request. Now let's define this user login request function. Let's pass in the event which got triggered and call prevent default function on that event. Now let's create a reference to our login form. Now we have to extract the data from the form. So we are going to create an object of type form data. So form data is another type of API which is available by default in our browsers, and it takes a form as its parameter. Then from that form, it is going to get all the input fields and their values and converts them into a query string. So const form data equals new form data with capital F. Now we have to pass our form reference to it. This way, this form data object will be created, which will extract all the input fields and their respective values from this form and transforms into a query string, which we can then send along with the fetch request. Now over here, we are ready to make a fetch call. So fetch call. Let's define the URL endpoint. Let's make it login.php. Now if we want to send this form data as a query string in our URL, so we can put like this, key equals value. But since our data is very critical, we don't want to send it attached in our query string. This way anyone can see it. Therefore, we want to send it in the body of this fetch request. So that means the request method that we have to use is not get, rather this time it's going to be a post method. But first, let's provide the second parameter, which is the callback. So user login response is the callback. Now the third parameter is the post, because this time we want to send this fetch request as a post request, not as a get request. But we also somehow need to provide this form data to this fetch request. So currently the way we have defined our fetch call is that it only takes 3 parameters at most: the URL endpoint and the callback function, which will receive the response from the server, and the default value for the HTTP request type. And since we had used default value get, therefore we never provided that value. But this time, since we are not using default value, we are using another HTTP method, which is post, therefore we must provide it. But we are still missing one thing, which is the actual form data that we want to be sent along in the body of this request. So that means we have to go back to our original fetch call facade, where we were defining it, and give it 4 parameters. So let's go to global.js, and this is the facade that we were creating. This one up to this yellow curly bracket. So it only takes 3 parameters. Now we are going to attach 4th parameter, which is going to be body. So we are also giving it some default value. So let's give it undefined. We can also use null as well, but let's start with undefined. So if you don't provide it, it means the body is undefined, because the GET request cannot contain any body. So having an undefined value for body will make it not create any problems. Okay, so this is the parameter. Now in the body over here, after the method, let's attach one more property, which is body, and we are going to give it this body. To avoid any confusion, let's change the name to data. Okay, so now this is the property name and this is the value. So the body contains data. Okay, now let's go back to our login.js. Now we can pass the form data to it, and it will be attached in the body of this fetch request and sent along with this fetch request to the backend. Okay, now we are ready to work on this callback function, user login response. So let's define this user login response function as an inner function. We don't need to, but since this is the practice we have taken so far, so we are going to continue that. The only place where it is very important to define the response as an inner function is when we have some data defined in this main function that we want to utilize within this inner function. So at that time, it is mandatory to define this response as an inner function. Otherwise, it's not mandatory. But since we have followed that practice, so therefore I'm going to continue following the same practice. Now within this function, for the time being, I'm just logging the response that we are going to receive from the backend. Later on, when we are able to see the response, then we will figure out how to further proceed. But for the time being, we are good to go. Now let's go to our backend and define this file, login.php. So let's go to our backend folder and create a login.php file. It shouldn't be in include, it should directly be in backend folder. Login.php. Let's first link our database connectivity file with this file. So require, in the current folder, we have a folder named include, and within this include, we have a file named db.php. Okay, now since we will get a post request from our login.js file, so if next method equals post. That means we will get some data in our post super global variable, which will contain two key value parameters. One is going to be with the key username and another one is going to be with the key password. So let's store them in our local variables. Now, since we are going to use data that we have received from the user in our SQL statement, so we must make sure that we are shielded from the SQL injection attacks. Therefore, we have to use prepared statement over here as well. So let's create a statement. Select everything from user, where username equals question mark and password also equals question mark. Now let's create a prepared statement, which we are going to get by executing a method on connection object, which is called prepare, and we have to pass this statement as SQL statement. Next, we have to bind the parameters with these question marks, which are actually placeholders. So we have to bind the values with those placeholders. So prep statement bind param, and since both of these values are going to be of type string, so that means 2s, the first value that we have to bind is username and the second is password. Now we are ready to execute this prepared statement. So prepared statement, execute. Now the thing is, this prepared statement will return true if we have successfully got some result from our database. If we didn't find any row matching the provided values, then in that case the execute will return as false. Since it returns a boolean value, so that means we can use it as a condition for if statement. So now rest of the statement will only execute if we have successfully got some result from the database. That means we have found a user with matching credentials. So in that case, we can proceed further, and the next statement is to actually get hold of the values, the row that has been returned from the backend. So what we are going to do is that we are going to call another method on this prepared statement, which is called get_result. Now we have got result of type result set in this variable. We have to convert this into an associative array which PHP can understand and process. So let's make it user array result fetch assoc. Now we have got one row as an associative array in this variable user_array. Now why we were interested in getting the data from this result set is that because now we want to start a session and we want to store all the information which might come handy once the user is logged in and has put some items in the cart as well, such as tracking the user, that which user it is, has he put anything in the cart, if yes, what are those items, what are the quantities of those items, prices, and etc. So from this point onward, we must have a session started and relevant values should be stored in the session variables. So we can do session_start here, but we start our session here, then this session will not have started in the other PHP files such as inventory, featured, and all these things. But we want to keep track of the user from this point onward. So that means we have to put this line session_start in all of those PHP files manually. So this is one solution. The another solution is going to be, if we put it inside this file db.php, then we won't have to make any changes anywhere in the other PHP files, and the session will have started in all of these files. So let's go to db.php. Now, even though we have named it db.php and we were making a connection with the database over here, let's put session_start over here as well. This way the session has started. But now the db.name is not an appropriate name because now this file is doing more than database connectivity. But if I rename this file, then I'll have to manually go to all of these files and rename it. That might confuse the beginner, so I'm going to keep this file name the same. But we might include some more information over here which might have nothing to do with database connectivity. Okay, so now let's go back to login.php file. So we don't need this file, line over here, because our session has already started. Now, even though it does not contain anything, and by any I mean user defined variables in it. So at this point, what we are going to do is that we are going to create two session variables. One is going to remember the user's username, and the other is going to remember the user's ID. This might come in handy when we are checking out. So let's create a session variable with the name logged user, and let's make this logged user an array, a two-dimensional array. So the first index is logged user, and another is going to be name, where we are going to store user array username. So the name that we have got from the database this time, not the one given by the user through login.js, because we want to be certain that we have actually got this in our database table. So that's why I'm using user underscore array. I could have used this username variable as well, because this also contains the username, but I want to be certain that it has actually come from our database. So therefore I'm going to use this user array. Now the second one is going to be the same session variable, but its second index is going to be ID, which is again going to come from the database. Since our usernames are unique in database, so we might not need this ID, but I'm going to keep it anyway over here, just in case we might need it in our future videos. If we don't need it, then I'll simply remove it from here. But let's keep it for the time being. And just to show you that how can we create a two-dimensional array in PHP as well. Now we are ready to respond back to the user. So echo JSON encode. Let's pass an array, and the key is going to be user, and the value is going to come from this thing, so that we are certain that our session has set. This way we will know for sure if the user value is empty at the front end. That means something went wrong when we were storing the values in the session variables. So whatever is wrong, it is wrong with the session creation thing. So that's why I'm using this longest version. I could have used this over here because it contains the same value, and I could have also used this username as well. But doing this lets me know if anything goes wrong, exactly where that thing has gone wrong. Okay. Now if that is not the case, then outside this if statement, copy, let's make it else, and paste, but change the value to invalid username or password. Now let's close the prepared statement and exit it. Okay. Now let's go to login.js. We should receive some data which is going to be user. So either it will contain the user's name or the text invalid username and password. Now let's go and test it out in the browser. Refresh to be certain. Login. So I think we created AAA as username and password AAA as well. F12. Something is not right. Okay, I forgot to include the access control allow header in my PHP file. So now I have two options over here. I can include the header over here like I have been doing in other PHP files. Let's see this one. Like, let's copy this and paste it in the login.php file. I can do that, but I think the best option would be to include it in db.php file. This way, I will never forget to include this header in the PHP files. And this also means that I can remove this header from the rest of the PHP files as well. Because now it's included in this db.php file. Okay, now let's close these files. Banner, featured, product, and db.php has this header. So we can still see all the contents. That means everything is working fine. Let's try to log in one more time. So we've got an error. Console is not defined, so E is missing at login.js line 45 and 47. Okay, login.js line 45. Okay, triple A. So we've got some result, but it's a null. That means something went wrong. Okay, so I've identified the problem. The problem is that we are storing the value in this variable username. Over here we have made spelling mistake. It's N-A-M-E. Okay, hopefully everything will work fine. AAA and password also AAA. Okay, so we have got this user with the value AAA. So that means we have successfully looked for a user in the backend and identified that this user exists. Let's put something random. So this should have returned us invalid username or password. Instead it returned null. Okay, so it turns out this execute will still return true even if no matching username and password has been found. And the reason for that is that the statement did execute successfully. It's just that no matching user was found, and it's not execute method's fault. So the execute is basically saying I did execute successfully, I made a successful connection with the database, executed a query, found out no such user exists, and I told you so. So I am going to return true because I have executed successfully. So that means we have to move this out of if statement because it's not serving our purpose. So prepared statement execute. We also have to move this one out. Let's discuss these two lines, what they are doing that we have moved up. So basically this is going to execute and it's going to return true if it successfully executes. It doesn't matter a matching result was found or not, as long as it executes successfully it will return true. Then what we are going to do in the next statement is that we are going to get the result set and storing it in the result variable. Now again the result set could be empty as well. So what we are going to do over here is that copy this, cut it and paste it over here. So what we are saying is that what we have got in the result variable, apply fetch assoc function on it, convert the result into an associative array which the PHP can understand, and then store it into this user array. Now if this user array is null, in that case we won't get into in the body of this if statement. We will directly move on to this else statement. However, if this user array is not empty or not null, in that case we will get inside this user array if statement. So I hope this will work now. Let's go and test it out in the browser. Let's put something random. Okay, invalid username or password. Good. Now let's put the credentials. So we have a user with the name AAA and password AAA as well. Okay, good. So this is working now. Now before we move any further, I have one clarification. I have directly stored the password. I am not applying any hashing on it. However, had this been a real commercial website, then I would have applied that hashing as well. But since over here the aim is to understand the overall working of website, so I have removed this complication from this project. It's not very difficult. You just have to add few more lines. But since I thought we already have a lot to cover, so I thought I should not include it in this project. Okay, with that clarification, now we can proceed further with the project. Now the thing is this, once we have successfully logged in, the immediate thing that should happen is that this overlay should disappear. So we have to now work on that. So let's go to our login.js. Before we go to login.js, in this else block, instead of putting the keyword user, let's put the key error. Now let's go to login.js. Now if we have got data, it will contain two properties. Either it will contain a property called user or it will contain a property called error in case of error. So what we are going to do is that we are going to say if data contains a property named user, then call a function, let's say display logged user. So the shortest way to define this is data.user, and let's make it display logged user and pass data.user because that contains the username in it. So if this is true, then this part will execute. If this is not true, then this part will never evaluate and never execute. So now let's go and define this display logged user function. Function display logged user, and it will take user as a parameter. The reason for defining this as a separate user is that we are going to call this function from other places as well. So over here, the first thing is that we have to remove the overlay because we have been logged in. This is overlay. Okay, next what we have to do is that let's go to our demo. Not demo, the one that we are creating. We need to replace this username with the actual name of the user that is logged in. So let's see where does it exist. So this is actually a spawn with a class named user, and it's inside the logged user div. So we can directly access this username and change its value. So const, let's make it logged user document query selector username logged user. Now let's change the text content of this logged user to be user. The other thing that we want to happen is that since now we have logged in, so we want to remove this login option as well as the registration icon, and we want only to make these two icons appear. So we have to call the function show hide icon twice, and we have to pass the login reference that we created at the beginning, and since we want to hide it, so let's pass true to it. Likewise, show hide function once more we have to call, and this time we have to pass the reference register and true. One more time, AAA. So you can see the name over here, and we have just two options, log out. Now here is the problem. Even though we have successfully logged in, if I refresh the page, you can see the logged user is gone, and again we are back with all of these four icons. So the reason for that happening is that when I refreshing it, the website starts getting loaded from the beginning, and only those contents are being loaded whose requests are loaded with DOM content loaded event. And since this login does not happen at the time of the DOM being loaded in the memory, so that's why we don't see any update over here. So what we need to do over here is that we have to associate another event listener with DOM content loaded event that will request the server and ask if the user has already been signed in. If that is the case, it will request the username and then call the same function which we just defined, which was this display logged user, pass the username to it, and this function in turn will again hide these two icons, display only these two ones, and replace this username with the name of the user that is logged in. So let's define this logic and see if our problem has been resolved or not. Now, since all event listeners which are associated with DOM content loaded, we have defined them in the global.js. So we are going to define this one in the global.js as well. So document.add event listener, DOM content loaded is the event, and the event handler or callback function is, let's give it name check login status. Now let's define this check login status function in the login.js. We simply have to make a fetch call over here to again login.php. This is going to be a GET request because we are not sending along any data in the body. So the only other thing that we have to define is the callback function, which is going to handle the response returned from the server. Let's make it response user login. Now let's define this function. We will have to revisit this function and attach some query string over here, but I'm not doing right now because right now there is no need, and if I attach query string right now it might not make much sense to you guys. So we are going to wait until the moment when it becomes mandatory to put it, because at that time the reasoning for putting a query string will also be clear. So let's keep it like that for the time being, and let's work on the response user login function. Let's make it an inner function because this is the practice we have been taking, and this will receive data from the server. For the time being, let's just console log this data. Then once we have defined the counterpart for this request at the back end, we will revisit and figure out what to do with this data. Okay, so let's go to login.php. Now we have to define the logic which is going to handle this request. Okay, so we are creating another if block, but this time the request method is get, not post, because we haven't got any data along with this fetch call. Okay, so over here what we have to do is that we have to look for the session variable named logged user. If that session variable is set, that means the user has already logged in, and we can get the user's name from that session variable and return it back to the front end. Otherwise, we will send the message that user is equal to guest, which will imply that no user has signed in yet, and whoever is visiting the website, he or she is visiting as a guest. So if is set $_ session and the key is logged user. If that is set, in that case we are going to echo back user, and its value is going to be, it's going to come from this session variable name, because this is where we have set the username over here. If that is not the case, then we are going to send another echo message, but this time the value for the user is going to be guest, and exit. So this was the backend logic for our check login status. So let's go to the browser, let's log in. Okay, now let's refresh. It says the user is guest. That means no user is logged in. Now I wonder why. So at least this part is clear, that we are able to get the response back from this get method. So our front end and back end logic is working. The only problem is that it's returning us a guest as a user who is currently visiting the website. However, we just logged in. Okay, so it was supposed to return us AAA as the user, but instead it has sent guest as the user who is currently visiting the website. Now can you think of a reason why this is happening? Now let me try to explain this with as simple explanation as possible. Since we are serving our front end and back end as two different websites, and the default behavior of PHP is that the moment a session is started, a session ID is created, which is sent back to the front end, which is part of the same domain as back end, which simply means it's sent back to the browser. The browser stores that session ID, and for each subsequent request that it makes next, it sends back that session ID to the server. And from that session ID, the server identifies the session of this particular user, and if there are other session variables associated with that particular session, the PHP server can return back values from those session variables. But in our case, our front end is a completely independent website. So even though when the session is created and the response that has been returned at the time of session creation, the PHP session ID is returned back to the browser. But now since browser is a part of a completely different website, so it cannot store that value, that session ID value in the browser, because now the domains are different. And since sessions are sent as cookie values, and cookies values are only supposed to exist or make sense for one domain, and our front end being different domain, the browser fails to register that session ID as part of its own. So let me show you. Let's go to the network. Now these are all the requests that have been made to the server so that we can see all this data in the browser. So let's look for the login.php. So this is the one, and so we have sent get request to the server from login.php, which is going to check if the user is logged in or not. And the headers that we sent, the headers that we received from that, we have got a session ID. So that means we should have that session ID stored in our application tab, and we have these cookies, and this is the domain of the front end. (127.0.0.1) and then port 5501. This is the one. So this is our URL. But as you can see, we don't have anything stored over here. That's because the front end domain is this thing, and the cookie is sent for a different domain, which is localhost 8081. So this cookie can be stored in the browser if the browser also had the same address. But since we don't have the same address, so even though we have received the cookie gets discarded. Now since we need this cookie ID so that we can send along with each HTTP request and make the server know that we are the same user who got logged in earlier, we have to change this default behavior. So to change this default behavior, we have to make certain changes at the front end and certain changes at the back end as well. So let's start with the front end changes. We have to go to global.js, and where we were defining the fetch facade, let's go there, this one. And over here, we have to define two more properties. One is mode. The value is course, cross-origin resource sharing. And the second is credentials, which is, so these two values will inform the backend that the request is between multiple domains, and with each request, we are going to include some credentials. Now these credentials can be many things, but in our case, it's going to be just a cookie. So this is the front end part setting. Now we have to go to the backend and make some changes at the backend as well. So let's go to db.php, where we were defining the header. Now over here we have to replace this asterisk for cross origin, allo origin, from asterisk to the exact URL of the front end domain, which is http 127.0.0.1 colon 5501, the exact URL that we see in the browser. Okay, and now since we are sending some credentials with the request, so we have to set another header to accept those credentials, which is access control allow credentials, and we have to set it to true. So these two are mandatory. Now let's go and let's test it out one more time. Login, AAA, AAA. Okay, now let's refresh. Still not working. Now what could be the reason? Let's inspect the network tab. Login.php. So this is get request. So our response has a cookie named PHP session ID, but if you notice over here, this yellow triangle, it says the cookie header didn't specify same site attribute and was defaulted to same site equals lex, and was blocked because it came from a cross-site response, which was not the response to a top-level navigation. Thus, the set cookie had to have been set with same site equals none to enable cross-site usage. So now when we solved first set of problem that we encountered at the beginning, now we are getting second type of problem. It's saying if the cookie is supposed to travel between cross domains, then we should have certain attributes defined as well, which was same site should be set to none. And since we haven't defined anywhere, so it's going to take the default value, which is lex. And with lex, the cookies cannot travel between domains. So where can we define these settings? Well, we have to go back to where we are starting our session. Let's go to db.php, and over here we have to provide an associative array with certain attributes. So currently it says same site should be set to none. This is actually cookie underscore same site. Okay, now let's go and try it out one more time and see if it has worked. Okay, so now let's inspect login.php. Never mind, let's refresh this first. Again, we are getting the same problem. So it says, this time the message is, this attempt to set a cookie via set cookie header was blocked because it had the same site equals none attribute, but did not have the secure attribute, which is required in order to use same site equals none. So that means we have to set another attribute called secure if we want same site equals none to work. So comma secure and give value true. So I keep forgetting I have to append everything with cookie underscore. So the property is same site, we have to append it with cookie underscore, and here property is secure, we have to append it with cookie underscore in PHP in order to work. Okay, now one more time. Login, AAA, AAA. Okay, now let's refresh. Okay, so it seems we are still back to square one. But I wonder why, because we have done all the settings we are supposed to. Let's check console. Okay, we have got the user. Oh, I see. Okay, that's because in the login.js, we are just displaying the message in the console. We are not calling the display logged user function. That's why we are getting back to the original state. So let's go to login.js, and over here, instead of displaying it in the console, we have to call this function back. But first we have to check if the data.user is not equal to guest, then we should display the logged user. So we are going to use again conditional short circuiting. Okay, data.user not equal to guest. In that case, we want to call this message, and we have to pass data.user. However, if data.user equals to guest, in that case, let's put user. In that case, we want to call another message, which should be display login register icons. So let's define this function. So this one is displaying the logout and logged users icon, and this one should display the login and register icons and hide these two icons. So we are going to copy this and let's set it to false. So we are setting this login to false. That means we want this login to be visible on the page. Likewise, we want this register icon to be visible on the page as well, therefore false. That means we don't want to hide them. However, for the other two icons, which is logout, we want that to disappear. So set it to true. Likewise, logged user as well, set it to true. Setting them true makes them disappear, and setting the icons false make them appear. So we should have these icons in the display logged user as well, but over here we are going to set the flag to false because we want them to be visible in the browser. So when the user is logged in, we want the login and register icon to disappear and logout and logged user icon to be present. Likewise, when we are not logged in, we want the login and register to be present on the browser and logout and logged user to be not present on the browser. Therefore, we have set these to true. Okay. Now let's refresh. So we can already see logout and logged user. However, why is this underneath this icon? Okay, so I have identified the problem. So let me show you. Let's inspect. Now if you notice, this text AAA is inside a span with the class name username, and then this span is inside a div which is named logged user. So at the top of login.js, we got references to all of the 4 divs which contained icons. So the div which contained logged user, we got a reference to it with the reference variable logged user. And inside the display logged user function, where is it? Over here, we were interested in getting a reference to the span with the class name username. But if you notice, we have given the same reference variable name that we gave to the div which contains this span as the child. So that's why over here it's actually trying to make the span disappear as well. So what we need to do is that with this we have to append the text span. I hope this will resolve the issue. Okay, let's log in. AAA. Good. Okay, now if we refresh, we don't lose the logged user. So that means this logic is working as well. Now we have to work on the logout part, such that when we click on this logout, the session should get destroyed and we should not be able to see this logged user's name over here. So we have to attach an event listener with this logout. So we have already created a reference to this logout. Okay, this one. Now we have to attach an event listener with this logout. So logout, add event listener, click, user logout. Now let's define this function, user logout. Now over here we have to make a fetch call to login.php to log the currently logged user out. So let's make a fetch call. login.php, and since it's a GET request, so we don't need to provide any parameters, just the callback function which is going to handle the response from the backend. So response logout. Now here is the problem. Before we define this function response logout, there is a problem. If we notice, when we are checking this login status, we are making a fetch call to the same URL endpoint with the get HTTP request method, and we are again making one more request to login.php. This is also a GET request, however the purpose over here is different. So this time we want the user, the logged user, to be logged out. Because both of them are presenting the same information to the backend, how would backend differentiate between these two, the purposes of these two requests? That is, how will backend decide that when the GET request for login.php comes, should it just check the status of the logged user and respond back the user's name, or should it log out the currently logged user? So we have to provide some kind of mechanism through which the backend can differentiate between the two requests. So what we are going to do is that we are going to attach a query parameter with these two, or maybe with just one. So question mark Q for query, and the value should be check status. You can write anything over here. The important thing is that this check login status has a query string attached to it, whereas this one doesn't have any query string attached to it. So now based on that, we can go to our login.php, and since we have attached the query with the check login status, so therefore let's go and make some changes over here. Put and is set $_ get a query with the name Q. So if this is set, that means it's a request to check if the user is logged in or not. However, if a request comes and we are not looking for any query string, then probably we are interested in logging out the user. Now inside the if block, we are going to put another if block just to be extra careful. If is set $_ session logged user. If we have a logged user, that means we have already created a session and some session variables as well. In that case, session _ unset. This is going to unset all the user defined session variables as well as the PHP session ID. Now we can destroy the session. So session _ destroy, and then echo JSON encode and pass an associative array logout and its value set to true, else let's copy, paste, and logout set its value to false. And then no matter if this inner if block executes or the else block executes, at the end we simply want to exit. That's it. So even if we don't put this if there, it will still work, but we want to be extra careful just in case somehow this request gets triggered when no user is logged in. In that case, we want to display this else block. Let's go to login.js because we haven't defined the response logout function. Let's just console log, for the time being, just log out the data. Then if data.logout, if the value is true, in that case display login register icons. So we are logged in. Let's click on the logout and we got logged out successfully. Let's check our console as well. So the logout is true. And as you can see, we have now login and register icons made visible. So that means we have successfully logged out as well. Now the only thing left is that we have to define the logic for registration.